This video covers enhancements made available in Release 57 to allow a default sourcing modifier to be set per supplier, and to provide a new XF or Sourced Transfer modifier. The modifier will behave just like the buyout modifier, but its purpose is to make it possible to report items sourced from sister stores separately from items sourced from outside vendors. This is useful for customers who consider items sold from company-owned sources as transfers and therefore want to report them separately. Now let's have a look at the new setup fields found on the Supplier Order Specific screen. A new Available Sourcing Modifier section has been added here. In order to make room for these fields, the Supplier Note entry box has been removed, but it can still be found on the Supplier Entry and on the line code screens. These new fields give the user total control over what modifiers are available at point of sale and what modifier will be the default for each vendor. Any modifiers that are checked will be available at point of sale. The radio button determines which will be the default. When creating a new supplier record, all three boxes will be checked by default and the buyout radio button will be ticked. The XF modifier will typically be used for the sister store and possibly other company-owned vendors, while outside suppliers will typically use BO and DS. But you can set this up in whatever way works best for your stores. Since this is my sister store vendor, I'm going to set it up with XF only, and I'll make that the default. Let's go to invoicing. First, the new XF modifier has been added to the modifier pop-up. At this point, any modifier is fine because we don't know yet where we're going to source the part. And per existing functionality, if we select the BO or DS modifier, we don't need to go into the sourcing screen. The system will automatically source the part from the default source for BO/DS vendor set up at Controls Store Source Setup. So here we can see the BO modifier item was assigned to my default source. The XF modifier doesn't have a default source. So in this case, a source won't be chosen. I'll have to go into sourcing and select one. So let's source 4. And as we can see here, there is no source vendor selected for the XF modifier. So I can go into sourcing and choose a source for that item. Let's source it from this first sister store. We'll go back to invoicing, and it's still the XF modifier. And I now have my source ID, which is my sister store 3. Now that we can assign modifiers and default modifiers to our suppliers, if I were to choose a modifier and then choose a supplier that didn't support that modifier, the system would automatically set the transaction to the supplier's default modifier. Now let's try quick sourcing. Maintaining functionality from previous releases, if the Use Quick Sourcing option is checked in Controls, System, General Setup, the Quick Sourcing window will display when entering a sell quantity greater than the quantity on hand on an invoice. Again, my quantity on hand is 0, and I'm going to enter a quantity of 4, and we get the quick sourcing pop-up or insufficient quantity pop-up. There are no visible changes to this pop-up as we don't show the modifier in this screen, but if I source an item here and click Accept Source, the item will be added to the invoice with my default modifier. So again, I'm sourcing from a sister store here, so we should see the XF modifier once we get back to invoicing. And there we go, and my source is sister store 3. We also made changes to the insufficient quantity window that displays when Use Quick Sourcing is unchecked in Controls, System, General Setup. Let's have a look at that. As of this release, the buyout and dropship buttons will only be available if those modifiers are enabled in the supplier. Otherwise, they'll be grayed out. And if either of these buttons are used, the modifier represented by the button will be applied, regardless of the default specified for the supplier in the supplier record. The transfer button will now use the default modifiers set up in the supplier record of the selected source. So again, I'm selecting our sister store 3, and if I click transfer, we should automatically see the XF modifier. Now let's look at returns. If a return is initiated from invoice image or Lisa return validation, the XF modifier will show in the returns grid. If the item is returned as resellable, a new RX or return transfer modifier will be automatically applied to the item. Functionality for the RX modifier is the same as the RB or return buyout modifier. But again, the transaction will be able to be reported separately because of having a different modifier. And we won't demo this, but if items are sourced from cataloging, that will also follow the modifier set up in the supplier. On the Lisa report, found at Reports, Lisa Transactions, the new XF and RX modifiers are now included in the Invoice Modifier dropdown. The new modifiers will also appear on the display and export versions of the transaction report as long as the modifier field was selected using columns displayed. Preview and Print will always report the modifier column, which now of course includes the XF and RX modifiers. This concludes our demo of the new RX and XF modifiers.